The early morning sun cast long shadows across the private aviation terminal as Dr. Maya Richardson checked her watch for the third time. It was 6:45 a.m., and she needed to be in Boston by 9:30 a.m. for an emergency heart surgery. She smoothly guided her black Mercedes G-Wagon into the reserved parking space, the same spot she'd been using for the past 5 years. Maya took a deep breath as she gathered her things. At 38 years old, she had already become one of the most respected cardiothoracic surgeons in the country. Today was especially important, not just because of the critical surgery waiting for her, but also because it was her first flight since being appointed as the new chief of surgery at Boston Memorial Hospital. The clicking of her sensible heels echoed through the parking area as she walked to the terminal entrance. She wore a perfectly tailored navy blue suit, her dark hair neatly pulled back in a professional bun, and carried her favorite brown leather medical bag. Around her neck hung the gold stethoscope her father had given her when she graduated from medical school, a reminder of the long journey that had brought her here. Several other passengers were already inside the terminal, most of them familiar faces from the hospital board. Maya noticed Dr. James Morrison, the board chairman, sitting near the window with his morning coffee. He had always been one of her strongest supporters, recognizing her talent long before others did. "Good morning, Charles," Maya said warmly to the usual morning receptionist as she approached the check-in desk. But Charles wasn't there today. Instead, she saw an unfamiliar face, a middle-aged security guard with Thomas Wells written on his name tag. He was busy looking down at some papers and hadn't noticed her yet. Maya placed her credentials and flight clearance documents on the counter. "Good morning," she said professionally. "I'm Dr. Richardson. I'm scheduled for the 7:15 flight to Boston." Wells slowly looked up from his papers. His eyes narrowed as they moved from Maya's face to her expensive suit, then back to her face again. The friendly expression he had been wearing moments ago when chatting with another passenger suddenly disappeared. "I think you might be in the wrong place," he said, his voice dripping with doubt. "The commercial terminal is about 2 miles down the road." Maya kept her composure, something she had mastered after years of dealing with similar situations. She smiled politely and slid her documents closer to him. "No, I'm in the correct place. I'm Dr. Maya Richardson, Chief of Surgery at Boston Memorial. I have all my credentials right here." Wells barely glanced at the papers. "Ma'am, this is a private aviation terminal. These flights are reserved for specific clients." He emphasized the last two words in a way that made his meaning clear. A few other passengers had started to notice the exchange. Some looked uncomfortable, while others pretended not to see what was happening. Dr. Morrison was still absorbed in his newspaper, unaware of the situation unfolding. Maya stood straighter, her 5'8" frame carrying the confidence of someone who had earned every bit of her success. "Mr. Wells," she said calmly, "I've been flying from this terminal for 5 years now. I have all the required credentials, and I'm running late for an emergency surgery. Would you please review my documentation?" Wells crossed his arms. "Listen, I've been working security for 15 years. I know who belongs here and who doesn't. I'm going to have to ask you to leave before there's a problem." The irony of his words wasn't lost on Maya. There was already a problem, but not the kind he was imagining. She reached for her phone, keeping her movements deliberate and calm. Years of performing complex surgeries had taught her that losing your cool never improved a situation. Behind her, the automatic doors opened as more passengers arrived. Maya could feel eyes on her back, but she maintained her professional demeanor. She had worked too hard and come too far to let someone's ignorance derail her morning, especially not when a patient's life was waiting on her arrival in Boston. This was just the beginning of what would prove to be a very interesting morning at the private aviation terminal. Thomas Wells stood behind the counter, his face getting redder by the minute. He couldn't believe this woman wouldn't just leave. In his 15 years of working security, he had never faced someone who stayed so calm while challenging his authority. "Ma'am," he said loudly, hoping others would hear, "I've already told you this is a private terminal. If you don't leave now, I'll have to call the police." Maya looked at her watch again. It was now 7 o'clock a.m., and her patient in Boston couldn't afford any delays. She pulled out her phone and quickly dialed a number, keeping her eyes locked with Wells's angry stare. "Who are you calling?" Wells demanded, his hand moving to rest on his security radio. "I'm calling my pilot, Jason," Maya replied calmly. "He's been flying me to Boston every other week for the past 5 years. I'm sure he can clear this up quickly. Wells scoffed. Your pilot? Listen, lady. Dr. Richardson, Maya corrected him firmly. Or Dr. Maya Richardson, Chief of Surgery at Boston Memorial Hospital, if you prefer the full title. More people had gathered in the terminal now. Some were pretending to read magazines or check their phones, but their eyes kept darting toward the scene at the counter. A young female employee behind the counter looked uncomfortable but didn't dare challenge Wells, who was her supervisor. Jason, the pilot, answered Maya's call on the second ring. Dr. Richardson, I was just about to call you. We're all fueled up and ready for Boston. Maya put the phone on speaker. Jason, I seem to be having some trouble at security. The new guard doesn't believe I'm supposed to be here. Could you please help explain the situation? What? Jason's surprise was clear even through the phone. Tom, is it you giving Dr. Richardson trouble? She's our most regular passenger. She flies with us to Boston almost every week for surgeries. Wells's face turned an even darker shade of red. How do I know that's really her pilot on the phone? This could be anyone. Just then, the terminal doors opened, and a tall man in a pilot's uniform walked in. It was Jason himself, having heard the commotion through the phone and come in from the plane. He looked confused as he approached the counter. Tom, what's going on here? Jason asked. Dr. Richardson is one of our VIP passengers. She's got the highest level of clearance. Wells shifted uncomfortably, but didn't back down. Protocol says I need to verify everything. These days, you can't be too careful about security threats. Maya raised an eyebrow at his choice of words. A security threat. I'm a surgeon running late for an emergency operation. Every minute we waste here puts my patient at greater risk. The young employee behind the counter finally spoke up. Mr. Wells, I found her records in the system. Dr. Richardson does have full clearance. She's been flying with us since 2019. Wells ignored her, instead pulling out a thick manual of security procedures. It says here that in case of any suspicious activity. A new voice joined the conversation. It was Dr. James Morrison, who had finally noticed the commotion. He walked over, coffee still in hand. The only suspicious activity I see is why our new chief of surgery is being harassed in her own hospital's private terminal. The color drained from Wells's face as he recognized Dr. Morrison, who was not only the hospital board chairman, but also a major stakeholder in the private aviation company. Dr. Morrison, I was just following protocol, Wells stammered. Was it protocol that made you ignore her valid credentials, or protocol that made you assume she was in the wrong place? Dr. Morrison's voice was calm but stern, or perhaps it was something else that made you treat our chief of surgery this way. The terminal had gone completely quiet. Even the usual sounds of papers shuffling and coffee machines whirring seemed to have paused. Maya stood tall, her dignity intact despite Wells' attempts to humiliate her. Jason, the pilot, stepped forward. Dr. Richardson, your plane is ready. Shall I take your bag? Maya nodded, handing him her medical bag. As she walked past Wells, she paused for a moment. Mr. Wells, I hope you understand that what happened here today isn't just about me. It's about every qualified professional who has ever been judged by their appearance rather than their credentials. I sincerely hope you learn from this experience. The confrontation was over, but its effects were just beginning to ripple through the terminal. As Maya walked toward the jet bridge with Jason the pilot, Wells's voice rang out behind them. Stop right there. This isn't over. He was now speaking into his radio, calling for backup. Security supervisor needed at main desk. Potential security breach in progress. Dr. Morrison stepped forward. Thomas, I strongly suggest you stop this right now. But Wells wasn't listening. His pride was hurt, and he seemed determined to prove he was right. Within minutes, 2 more security guards rushed into the terminal. They were both younger than Wells and looked confused about why they had been called. That woman is trying to board a private jet without proper authorization, Wells told them, pointing at Maya. She needs to be escorted out immediately. The younger guards looked at each other uncertainly. One of them, whose name tag read Mike, spoke up. But sir, isn't that Dr. Richardson? She flies out every week. Wells's face turned red again. You're all being fooled. How do we know she's really who she says she is? For all we know, she could have stolen those credentials. The terminal had become very crowded now. Other doctors and hospital staff who were scheduled for later flights had arrived and were watching the scene unfold. Many of them knew Maya well and were shocked by what they were seeing. Maya turned around slowly, her patience being tested but her voice remaining steady. "Mr. Wells, let me explain this one last time. I am Dr. Maya Richardson. I am the chief of surgery at Boston Memorial Hospital. I have a patient waiting for emergency surgery, and every minute we waste here puts their life at risk." She opened her phone and pulled up the hospital's website, showing her profile page with her photo and credentials. She then showed them her medical license, pilot-approved clearance, and even her Harvard Medical School alumni card. "Would you like to see my driver's license, too?" she asked calmly. "Or perhaps you'd like to call the president of Harvard Medical School. I'm sure he'd be happy to verify my credentials." The other passengers were now openly showing their support for Maya. Several had their phones out, recording the incident. A few were already making calls to the aviation company's corporate office. Sarah Chen, a young nurse who often assisted Maya in surgery, stepped forward from the crowd. "I've worked with Dr. Richardson for 3 years. She's one of the best surgeons in the country. She saved my father's life last year when no other doctor would even attempt the surgery." More voices joined in, each sharing their own stories about Maya's skill and dedication as a surgeon. Wells looked increasingly uncomfortable as he realized just how many people in the terminal knew and respected Dr. Richardson. The terminal manager, Mr. Rodriguez, finally arrived, having been called by several concerned employees. He took one look at the situation and immediately understood the severity of what was happening. "Dr. Richardson, I sincerely apologize for this incident," he said, genuine concern in his voice. "Please, proceed to your flight. We'll deal with this situation immediately." But Maya paused. She looked at Wells, who was now sweating and looking at the floor. "Mr. Wells," she said, making him look up at her, "I want you to understand something. Today, your actions didn't just delay a doctor. They potentially put a patient's life at risk. When you let your prejudices cloud your judgment, the consequences can be far more serious than you realize." She turned to Mr. Rodriguez. "I trust you'll handle this appropriately. Not just for me, but for anyone else who might face similar treatment in the future." The terminal manager nodded firmly. "Absolutely, Dr. Richardson. Mr. Wells, please come with me to my office immediately. Your services won't be needed for the rest of the day." As Maya finally walked toward her plane, accompanied by Jason and Dr. Morrison, she could hear Mr. Rodriguez addressing all the security staff about an emergency meeting regarding proper protocol and anti-bias training. The incident was far from over, but Maya's focus had already shifted to her patient in Boston. As she boarded the private jet, she pulled out her patient's file, reviewing the complex procedure ahead. She had won this battle against prejudice, but her real work, saving lives, was just about to begin. As Maya settled into her seat on the private jet, her phone started buzzing with messages and notifications. Videos of the incident were already spreading through the hospital staff's group chats. But Maya had more pressing concerns. Her patient in Boston couldn't wait much longer. "Dr. Richardson," Jason called from the cockpit. "Boston Memorial just radioed. They want to know about our delay." Maya quickly dialed the hospital's number. Dr. Sarah Peters, her colleague in Boston, answered immediately. "Maya, where are you? Mr. Johnson's condition is getting worse." "I'm on the plane now, Sarah," Maya replied, her voice steady despite the morning's events. "Had a situation at security. We're taking off in 5 minutes. How's his oxygen level?" "Dropping slowly." "But Maya..." Sarah hesitated. "You should know that the videos of what happened at the terminal are already reaching Boston. The hospital board here is furious. They're talking about filing a formal complaint against the aviation company." Maya closed her eyes for a moment. She hadn't wanted this to become a big story. She just wanted to do her job and save lives. But maybe, she thought, this incident could lead to important changes. Back in the terminal, things were getting even more intense. The aviation company's regional director, Mr. Thompson, had arrived after receiving multiple calls about the incident. He found Wells still arguing with Mr. Rodriguez in the office. "I was just following protocol," Wells insisted. "You can't blame me for being careful." Mr. Thompson's face was stern. "Careful? You ignored valid credentials, refused to check the passenger database, and delayed a critical emergency flight. That's not being careful, that's something else entirely. Meanwhile, Dr. Morrison was making calls of his own. As both the hospital board chairman and a major investor in the aviation company, his words carried weight. Yes, Mr. Chairman, he spoke into his phone. I witnessed the entire incident. Dr. Richardson handled it with incredible grace, but this needs to be addressed at the highest level. The young security guard, Mike, knocked on the office door. Sir, he said nervously, there are news reporters outside. Someone posted the videos online and they've gone viral. Mr. Thompson looked at Wells. Do you understand what you've done? This isn't just about one incident anymore. You've put both our company and the hospital in a difficult position, and more importantly, you've put a patient's life at risk. In the air, Maya focused on reviewing her patient's files. Mr. Johnson needed a complex heart valve replacement, and every detail had to be perfect. She refused to let the morning's events affect her concentration. Jason's voice came over the intercom. Dr. Richardson, Boston Memorial has arranged for a police escort from the airport to the hospital. We'll make up some time that way. Maya nodded, grateful for the support but sad that it was necessary. As she looked out the window at the clouds below, she thought about all the young medical students she mentored, especially the minorities. How many of them faced similar prejudices every day? How many were questioned, doubted, or blocked from doing their jobs? Her phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from the aviation company's CEO, copying both the hospital board and her directly. Dr. Richardson, we are deeply disturbed by this morning's events. Please accept our sincere apologies. We are launching a full investigation and will be implementing immediate changes to our security training protocols. Your dedication to your patient, despite facing such unacceptable treatment, is admirable. We would appreciate your input as we develop new anti-bias training programs for our staff. Best regards, James Wilson, CEO, Elite Aviation Services. Maya forwarded the email to her assistant with a simple note: schedule a meeting. This needs to be more than just words. The plane started its descent into Boston. Maya could see the hospital in the distance, where her patient and team were waiting. The events at the terminal had delayed her by 40 minutes, but she was finally almost there. As she gathered her medical bag, Maya made a decision. Once her patient was safe, she would use this incident to push for real change, not just at the aviation company, but throughout the medical community. Sometimes, she realized, standing your ground wasn't just about defending yourself. It was about making sure others wouldn't have to face the same battles in the future. The police escort sirens cleared a path through Boston's morning traffic as Maya's car rushed from the airport to Boston Memorial Hospital. The clock showed 9:45 a.m. She was 45 minutes behind schedule because of the incident at the terminal. As her car pulled up to the hospital's emergency entrance, Maya saw a group of reporters gathered outside. News of the terminal incident had spread faster than she expected. Camera flashes went off as she stepped out of the car, but she walked past them without comment. Dr. Peters met her at the entrance. Maya, you're not going to believe what we just found out about that security guard, Wells. Sarah, let's focus on Mr. Johnson first, Maya replied, already walking toward the surgical floor. How is he? Stable for now, Dr. Peters said, matching Maya's quick pace. But that's not all. Wells used to work security here at Boston Memorial 3 years ago. He was fired for similar incidents of harassment against doctors and staff of color. Maya stopped walking for a moment. This was an important piece of information that changed everything. He worked here? And the aviation company didn't know about this when they hired him? Apparently, he used different references, Dr. Peters explained. The hospital's HR department just confirmed it. They're sending all the documentation to the aviation company right now. As they reached the surgical floor, they found Dr. James Morrison waiting for them. He had taken a different private jet to Boston right after Maya's flight. Dr. Richardson, he said gravely, I just had a very interesting conversation with the hospital's legal team. It seems Mr. Wells has a history of these incidents. This isn't just about one bad morning. It's about a pattern of behavior that should have been stopped long ago. Maya nodded, but her mind was already shifting to her patient. She could see Mr. Johnson's family waiting anxiously in the hallway. We'll deal with that later, she said. Right now, I have a life to save. As Maya headed to scrub in for surgery, the hospital's administrative office was buzzing with activity. The CEO of Boston Memorial, Dr. Patricia Chen, had called an emergency meeting with the board members who were present. "This is a bigger problem than we thought," Dr. Chen announced to the room. "Wells worked at 3 different hospitals before coming to us. He was fired from each one for similar discriminatory behavior. He kept getting rehired because no one reported him properly. We need to change this system." Meanwhile, back at the private terminal, Mr. Thompson was having his own revelation. After a thorough background check that should have been done before hiring Wells, he discovered more troubling information. He lied on his application, Mr. Thompson told his team. He changed his employment dates to hide the gaps between jobs. He used friends as references instead of his real supervisors. And we missed it all because we didn't dig deep enough. The young security guard, Mike, spoke up again. "Sir, there's something else you should know. Some of us tried to report Wells' behavior before. He made inappropriate comments about several passengers, not just Dr. Richardson, but our complaints never went anywhere." In the surgical preparation room, Maya was focused entirely on her upcoming procedure. As she scrubbed her hands, Dr. Peters shared one final piece of information. "The aviation company's board of directors is meeting this afternoon," she said. "They're not just firing Wells. They're completely overhauling their hiring and training processes. Your stand this morning is going to change things, Maya." Maya looked at her reflection in the surgical room window. She saw not just herself, but all the other medical professionals who had faced similar discrimination. The security guard's past was finally catching up with him, but the real victory would be in the changes this incident would bring. "Changes are good," Maya said, pulling on her surgical gloves. "But right now, we have more immediate concerns. Mr. Johnson needs us focused on his heart, not on hospital politics." As she walked into the operating room, Maya knew that this revelation about Wells's past would have far-reaching consequences. But for the next few hours, she would do what she did best, prove her worth not through words or credentials, but through the skilled hands that had saved hundreds of lives. The surgical team stood ready, waiting for her instructions. Despite the morning's events, despite the revelations and the media attention, Dr. Maya Richardson was exactly where she needed to be, standing at an operating table, ready to save another life. While Dr. Maya Richardson was performing surgery at Boston Memorial Hospital, the consequences of the morning's incident were spreading like wildfire. Back at the private aviation terminal, Thomas Wells sat in the company's conference room, facing a panel of senior executives. "Mr. Wells," the company's head of human resources began, "we've reviewed the security footage, checked your employment history, and spoken with witnesses. Would you like to explain your actions this morning?" Wells shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by nervous fidgeting. "I was just trying to maintain security," he mumbled. "How was I supposed to know who she was?" Mr. Thompson, the regional director, placed a thick folder on the table. "We have here Dr. Richardson's flight records showing she's been a regular passenger for 5 years. We have her complete credentials, which you refused to verify. We have statements from multiple employees who tried to tell you who she was. And now," he paused, opening the folder, "we have your real employment history." Wells's face went pale. The HR director continued, "You were fired from 3 hospitals and 2 security companies for discriminatory behavior. You lied on your application. You used fake references. Did you think this wouldn't catch up with you?" Outside the conference room, reporters had gathered at the terminal's entrance. The story had gone viral on social media, with millions of views and thousands of comments. Multiple civil rights organizations had already reached out to both the aviation company and Boston Memorial Hospital. Meanwhile, at Boston Memorial, Maya's hands moved skillfully as she performed the complex heart valve replacement on Mr. Johnson. In the observation room above the operating theater, several board members watched in amazement. "Look at her focus," Dr. Morrison whispered to Dr. Chen. "After everything that happened this morning, she's performing one of the most difficult procedures with perfect precision." Dr. Chen nodded. "That's exactly why we made her chief of surgery. Nothing shakes her concentration when a patient's life is at stake." Back at the terminal, the consequences for Wells were becoming clear. The HR director stood up, holding an official document. "Mr. Wells, your employment with Elite Aviation Services is terminated, effective immediately." Additionally, we will be reporting your falsified application and history of discriminatory behavior to the Security Industry Oversight Board. Wells protested, "You can't do this. I have rights." "Yes, you do," Mr. Thompson replied firmly. "Just like Dr. Richardson had the right to board her flight without harassment. Just like every passenger has the right to be treated with respect regardless of their appearance. You violated those rights repeatedly, and now you face the consequences." The company's legal team entered the room with more papers. "Mr. Wells, we're also cooperating with investigations from the Civil Rights Commission and the State Security Board. Your security license will likely be revoked." In the hospital's operating room, Maya completed the final stitches on Mr. Johnson's heart. The procedure had been successful. As she stepped back from the operating table, the entire surgical team broke into applause, not just for the successful surgery, but for everything she represented. Later that afternoon, while Maya was checking on her recovering patient, the aviation company released an official statement. Elite Aviation Services announces immediate changes following this morning's discriminatory incident. 1. Complete overhaul of hiring processes. 2. Mandatory anti-bias training for all staff. 3. New security verification protocols. 4. Creation of a passenger advocacy board. 5. Partnership with civil rights organizations for ongoing training. We deeply regret the treatment Dr. Richardson experienced and are committed to ensuring such incidents never happen again. The hospital's PR team brought the statement to Maya as she finished writing her post-operation notes. She read it quietly, then looked at Dr. Peters, who was standing nearby. "Sometimes," Maya said softly, "it takes one incident to expose a bigger problem. Wells losing his job isn't enough. We need to fix the system that kept giving him chances to discriminate." Dr. Chen entered the room with more news. "Maya, the aviation company wants you to head their new passenger advocacy board. They think your experience and perspective could help prevent future incidents." Maya looked through the window at Mr. Johnson's family, who were crying tears of joy after hearing the surgery was successful. "Tell them I'll consider it," she said. "But right now, my priority is my patient's recovery." The consequences of that morning's incident would continue to unfold, but Maya had already achieved her most important goal, saving another life despite the obstacles placed in her way. 1 week had passed since the incident at the private terminal. Dr. Maya Richardson sat in her office at Boston Memorial Hospital, reviewing the changes her stand had sparked across multiple institutions. On her desk lay several newspapers. The headlines told the story. "Major aviation company overhauls security protocols after discrimination incident." "Former security guard's pattern of discrimination exposed." "Boston Hospital Chief of Surgery sparks nationwide conversation on workplace bias." Maya picked up a letter from the National Medical Association. They wanted her to be their keynote speaker at the upcoming conference, focusing on challenges faced by medical professionals of color. She had already received similar invitations from 12 other organizations. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Sarah Chen, the young nurse who had supported her at the terminal that day. "Dr. Richardson," Sarah said excitedly, "you need to see this. The changes are already happening." She handed Maya her phone, showing an email from Elite Aviation Services to all their frequent flyers. The company had implemented a new passenger verification system, complete with a digital ID app that made credentials instantly verifiable. They named it the Richardson Protocol. But the biggest change was happening right at Boston Memorial. Dr. Chen, the hospital CEO, had used the incident to launch a comprehensive review of their own hiring practices and security protocols. They discovered that similar discrimination had gone unreported in many departments. "We've started anonymous reporting channels," Dr. Chen explained in the staff meeting that morning. "No one should fear speaking up about discrimination, and no one should face barriers to doing their job because of how they look." Maya's phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Johnson, her patient from last week. His recovery was going well, and he had written a powerful letter to the hospital board supporting the changes being made. His words, "I'm alive today because Dr. Richardson refused to let discrimination stop her from reaching me," had deeply moved everyone who read them. Later that afternoon, Maya visited the hospital's medical school program. The young students, especially those from minority backgrounds, looked at her with new admiration. One student raised her hand. Dr. Richardson, she said nervously, I almost quit medical school last month after someone questioned if I belonged here. But after seeing how you handled that security guard, it gave me strength to continue. Maya smiled warmly. Remember this, she told the students. Your worth isn't determined by those who doubt you, but by the lives you touch and the changes you create. That security guard didn't just challenge me that day, he challenged every person who has ever been judged by their appearance rather than their abilities. The impact stretched beyond Boston. Other hospitals and private aviation companies across the country began reviewing their policies. Wells's case had exposed a gap in employment verification systems, leading to new national guidelines for security staff hiring. Back in her office, Maya received another important email. The aviation company's board of directors had unanimously approved her suggestions for their new training program. Every security staff member would now go through extensive anti-bias training, including real-world scenarios and cultural sensitivity workshops. Dr. Morrison stopped by her office with more news. Maya, remember those other people Wells harassed? 10 of them have come forward now. Each story is helping build a stronger case for industry-wide changes. Maya nodded, then pointed to her computer screen. Look at this. 3 other hospitals have already adopted our new reporting system. Sometimes it takes one incident to start a revolution. As she prepared for her evening rounds, Maya thought about how one morning's confrontation had turned into a movement for change. The incident wasn't just about her anymore, it had become a catalyst for addressing deeper issues in multiple industries. Dr. Richardson, her assistant, called. The governor's office is on line 1. They want you to serve on the State Medical Ethics Board, specifically to address discrimination in healthcare settings. Maya picked up the phone, ready to take on another role in creating positive change. The security guard who tried to stop her that morning had actually opened doors, not just for her, but for countless others who would face similar challenges in the future. The impact of her stand was still growing, rippling out into the world, changing policies, attitudes, and lives. Sometimes, Maya realized the most important operations she performed weren't in the surgical theater, but in the theater of life itself. 1 month had passed since the incident that changed everything. Dr. Maya Richardson stood at the podium in Elite Aviation's main terminal, addressing a large crowd of reporters, aviation staff, and medical professionals. The terminal looked different now. New signs clearly displayed passenger rights, and the security staff wore badges indicating they had completed the new anti-bias training program. Today, Maya began, we're not just opening a new chapter, we're writing a new book. A book where qualification matters more than appearance, where dignity is a right, not a privilege. Behind her sat Mr. Johnson, her patient whose life she had saved despite the delay that morning. Next to him were his wife and children, all wearing badges that read Richardson Protocol Advocate. Mr. Johnson had become one of the strongest supporters of the new changes. In the audience, Sarah Chen, the young nurse, sat with a group of medical students. They were all part of the new mentorship program Maya had started at Boston Memorial Hospital, aimed at supporting minority healthcare professionals. 1 month ago, Maya continued, a security guard thought he had the right to judge me by my appearance. Today, that same guard's actions have led to changes that will protect thousands of others from similar discrimination. The changes were impressive. On the wall behind her hung a large poster listing the improvements. The Richardson Protocol, a new digital verification system for all private aviation terminals. Mandatory quarterly anti-bias training for all staff. Anonymous reporting systems with guaranteed follow-up. Directory of all certified medical professionals for quick verification. Security staff diversity initiative. Monthly review of all reported incidents. Partnership with civil rights organizations. Thomas Wells, the former security guard, had tried to appeal his firing but failed. Instead, his case had become a teaching example in the new training program, showing exactly what not to do and why bias had no place in professional settings. Maya looked at the crowd and saw Dr. Morrison smiling proudly. The hospital board chairman had kept his promise to support real change. Boston Memorial had become a model for other hospitals, showing how to create an environment of respect and equal treatment. But our work isn't finished, Maya said firmly. Just last week, I received letters from healthcare professionals across the country sharing similar stories. Each letter reminds us why we must continue pushing for change. She then made a surprising announcement. Today, I'm proud to launch the Richardson Foundation for Professional Equity. This foundation will provide legal support to professionals facing discrimination, fund anti-bias training programs, and offer scholarships to minority students in medical and aviation fields. The crowd erupted in applause. In the back of the room, several of the security staff who had supported Maya that morning wore special pins identifying them as foundation volunteers. After the speech, Maya took questions from reporters. "Dr. Richardson, what would you say to that security guard now?" Maya smiled thoughtfully. "I would thank him, not for what he did, but for showing us what needed to change. Sometimes our biggest obstacles become our greatest opportunities for progress." Later that evening, as Maya prepared for her regular flight to Boston, now much smoother with the new protocols, she received an unexpected letter. It was from Wells's daughter. "Dear Dr. Richardson, my father's actions were wrong. The changes you created from that wrong have inspired me. I'm now studying to become a doctor, hoping to be part of the positive change you've sparked. Thank you for showing us a better way forward." Maya carefully folded the letter and put it in her bag. As she walked through the terminal, she saw her own story displayed on a wall dedicated to promoting diversity and respect. But more importantly, she saw the faces of the security staff, now more diverse, better trained, and truly professional. A young security officer opened the door for her. "Have a good flight, Dr. Richardson," she said with genuine respect. Maya nodded, knowing that her experience had transformed into something much bigger than herself. The guard who tried to block her path had instead helped her build new roads for others to follow. As her plane took off into the evening sky, Maya smiled. Sometimes authority isn't just about proving who you are, it's about changing the world for those who will come after you. And that change, like the most crucial operations she performed, required both skilled hands and an unwavering heart.